The RDS Leadership Conversation with Amber Mann Riggs and Israel Steinmetz, answering questions leaders are asking. So a moment ago, you mentioned that we can be really focused on what we're doing to pursue communion with God, and that even in our rest, even in our stillness, God is at work. I want to take that a step further and acknowledge that God is always at work when we're working, when we're not working, when we're rebelling actively against Him. God is always at work in our lives. And that God is actually the main player in our lives. We are so self-consumed. And we're so self-consumed in our communion with God.
Yes.
We really believe that our communion with God depends entirely on us. If I'll just read a little more, pray a little more, worship a little more, confess a little more, serve a little more, then I'd be closer to God. As if God is this passive participant who's kind of sitting there saying, okay, I saved you, now the relationship is on you. You better keep it healthy, you better keep it running. And so much of the way that we think and feel about our, quote, relationship with God is based on the idea that we are the only active participant in it.
I have to interrupt.
Okay.
I caught sight of some church board meeting notes years ago, and I was amused because it listed the participants there, and then it said, Holy Spirit, ever-present observer.
Yikes.
And so it's like, I hope the Holy Spirit is shaping the direction of this church meeting. But it was still,
it's very
pervasive.
revealing because it's that note, as embarrassing as it might be, that note is how we typically think and operate and talk and feel. That God is somewhere out there observing us, keeping tabs on us, but He's not very active. One of the big paradigm shifts for me is to think of our life as a play. And what we typically do when if we were to think of our lives as a play, our typical thought would be, I'm the main actor in the play, and God is, at best, God is an off-screen director. Okay? God's somewhere out there, and maybe He's pulling the strings of human history, and maybe He's leading me to do this, and guiding me to do this, and giving me a line here or there, and maybe He even wrote the script, but I'm the actor, and God is off stage. And what is so incredible about God, and what is chiefly revealed in Jesus Christ, is that God is actually the primary actor in human history. And that when that wasn't obvious enough, when His role wasn't clear enough, He stepped on the stage in physical form. And so to re-envision our lives, to say, I'm not the main character in my life. God is the main character in my life. Jesus Christ incarnate is the main actor. I have a tiny bit part in my own life, not just the scope of human history. In my own life, I have a tiny bit part. God is the one acting in my life, and my role only matters in so much as it relates to His role. I'm playing off of Him. I'm responding to Him. God is the more active player in my life. That is an incredibly different way of thinking about life and thinking about our formation as people, as leaders, that whatever I'm doing, God is doing more, not necessarily in quantity or the ways we would measure it, but God is doing more that is actually shaping me, that's actually forming me for His service, that's actually transforming me into His image. God is doing work I cannot do. Most of it I can't see. But God is the one who is making me fit to lead on His behalf.
And yet He also invites us to partner with Him.
Yes, to
in
respond
that work,
to
to
His
respond
work.
to His leadership.
That sanctification, like salvation, sanctification is by grace through faith. We do respond in trust, in faith, to His work in our lives, and that is what empowers us and enables us and directs us to live for Him. But that's always a response. We tend to think of salvation as by grace through faith, sanctification is by effort, by work.
And yet I can hear someone saying, well, if God's always acting on me, then why do I need to be intentional about any of this? Because I should just trust God and whatever God's doing in my life, that's God's will.
And the answer is that while God is always acting, God is always acting as a God who has created us to have our own choices, to have our own responses, to have our own trust. God is not controlling us like robots. God is acting in our lives, and he is wanting us to respond to him. So the intentionality comes in, how will I respond to what God is doing in my life? The intentionality is in saying there really is a relationship of two parties here. Two parties, both required to act, both required to respond and interact. But our response is always secondary. God always initiates at every stage. His is to initiate, ours is to respond.
And so often I think that going back to the stage analogy, sometimes if we're not aware that God's the main player, we're not looking at him.
Right, we're looking at ourselves.
We're looking at ourselves.
And the other performers.
And the other performers.
Yeah.
And when in reality, in a stage production, the other performers are always aware that whatever they're doing on the stage should be so complementary to what's going on that it's not stealing attention away from the main, from the star of the show.
Right. And so as we focus on Christ as central in our lives, instead of us as central, instead of the plot as central, instead of the other characters as central, when we focus on Christ as center, that is really what's at the heart of communion with God. And I think that's what Jesus is getting at when he identifies loving God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, all your mind. When he says that's the most important thing in life, it's because that is communion with God. That is focusing on God as the central thing, as the greatest thing. That is the acknowledgement of God as the key player. And then what that does is, for the leader, that becomes the source of spiritual authority, spiritual influence. If we're called to influence on God's behalf, we can't influence on God's behalf unless we are communing with God. We can't speak God's words unless we're hearing God's voice. We can't convey God's heart unless we are close to the heart of God. And so this source, the foundation of spiritual authority to actually influence people for God, comes from this close connection with God. The deeper and wider and stronger that connection, the deeper and wider and stronger our influence. And that allows us to influence people across cultures, across ethnic backgrounds, across demographic backgrounds. Like, the gospel is powerful. God's spirit and grace are powerful, and communicated through us, they are powerful. It doesn't matter if you're a different age, if you're a different color, if you're a different gender, if you're a different religious background, if you're a different culture, whatever it is, like, that is the power of God. He cuts through every culture. He cuts through every difference and unites us together with him. And we have that ability only through communion with God. You can't get that through enough training or enough experience or enough work to cut through all of those boundaries. The spiritual authority of being in God's presence and carrying his presence is the only thing that allows us to lead and influence on God's behalf wherever we go.